We are back with our good friend of the classroom, Abraham Maslow, for this lesson. And we're going to look at 3 interlinked lessons to help you become a more radioactive and intrinsically motivated real person instead of an object that is performing to some made-up audience. That's a bit of a sneak peek of what we're covering. So first things first, let's look at these 2 people to illustrate our first lesson. So what commonly happens if we're not careful is that we project a lot of things onto this other person and we react to those things rather than the person themselves. So by that I mean, rather than seeing him, what I see is instead my positive expectations of him and my negative expectations of him. And I'll also be judging him in accordance to how close he is in terms of living, in terms of my rules. Could write that out as another point. And I'll also be looking at his motivations as well. So, a bit of a mess there, but you can see what I'm getting at. So essentially, anything that can be considered an abstraction. Something I'm expecting or preparing to experience rather than what I'm actually experiencing. And notice that the more that you project these things onto them, the less you actually see them. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on the abstractions and the expectations themselves, and we react to those abstractions and those experiences, not this person themselves. So what we need is a more person-centered perspective. One where we see the interaction as one person dynamically encountering another person. Not one person performing for an audience, which includes an audience of 1 in this particular case. So what we need to do is we need to stop seeing ourself, first of all, as just an abstraction as well. So reverse the projections and see what this reveals about you instead. What are your expectations and explicit or hidden motives about yourself? And how do you live your own life? Because to see them as a real person, full of all their peaks and the troughs, you need to see yourself as a real person as well. That's also the wider purpose of shadow work, which has a big crossover with self-actualization. So the idea with this is that it's not good to just overcome evil, but to overcome the polarity to begin with and to pursue instead wholeness. We don't necessarily want to become good so much as become real and able to make sense of our highest and our lowest moments and potentials. And then we'll find ultimately that the more I'm able to become a healthier and fuller version of me, then the more I'm able to encourage this in others, or at the very least perceive it in others. So it's not a simple one-dimensional persona-obsessed character performing for one another. It's more of 2 complex, paradoxical and fuller people exploring who each of them are in a conversation. So to bring this first mini lesson to a close, let's use Maslow's own wording, which, if I remember rightly, is on page 41 for this. And we're going to jump from the top to the bottom of the page. So, one cannot place a whole person on a continuum, only an abstracted aspect of a person. And to make this really practical, there's a really great question down here as well. Do we see the real concrete world, or do we see our own system of rubrics, motives, expectations, and abstractions which we have projected onto the world, onto the real world, Or, to put it very bluntly, do we see or are we blind? And that pulls us quite nicely into lesson 2. So we've realised that these abstractions are not a good place to start with when we're trying to understand another person. And they're not great for understanding ourselves either. So let's bring the focus back onto the person. And I'm going to borrow a quote from another one of his books for this one. So this one is from the book Maslow on Management. So we're going to jump straight to page 93 for this single line here. Realistic perceiving is a prerequisite to realistic behaving, and realistic behaving is prerequisite to good results. Nice straightforward sentence there if we're able to break all this down. So diagrammatically, we've got perceiving first, Hopefully this shows up. Yeah, I think it will do. Then we've got behaving. So I'll draw that as a separate height so it's easier to read. And then we've got results. So it needs to be one first, then the other, then the other. There's no point focusing on achievements or results just yet because we're getting too far ahead of ourselves. So if we've just covered this perceiving bit in lesson 1, then what are the behaviors that we should focus on? And in short, these behaviors are inspired by what Maslow calls the 14 being values. These are essentially all qualities that support and reinforce each other and which can't be reduced down to each other either. I won't go into detail here because these are supposed to be a trio of mini lessons, but they come from a study of his reports of people describing their peak experiences and what seemed most important to them. So the idea is that none of these values can truly be cut off from another because they all support one another. I'm not going to draw out every single line on here, but just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So to make this mini lesson simple, practical, and quite straightforward ideally as well, check to see if your behavior is in line with these values. And if you notice an area where it isn't, start making your corrections there. And again, we're not focusing on abstracting one or two of these values away from all the others and pursuing them at the cost of others, but instead we're trying to move our entire being to be in alignment with them. In the same way, if we was to draw this out, this is going to be really rough on it because it's quite... In fact, I've got this. This is going to be better instead. So in the same way, if we think about it as a cube that has 6 faces, I'm just going to draw 3 on here to make it practical. All of these faces are equally important, and it's the same for the 14 being values. It makes no sense to say that one face of a cube is better or worse than any of the others. And if we tried to remove, for example, this particular face because you didn't like it for some reason, then you're going to be left with a 5-faced cube, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So Maslow is trying to argue the same thing here, in the sense that you can't consider yourself to be a truly self-actualizing person and in touch with the highest values if you actively dislike, let's say, 4 or 5 of them. So to bring all of this back together, the other person needs to be treated as a whole and not just an object that I can project my rules and my expectations onto. But I also need to treat myself as a whole and not an object, so that I don't reduce myself down and my own self-esteem, and I don't ignore my own capacities. And in this case, to raise this self-esteem and to be truly fulfilled by using these capacities, I need to see my overall behavior as being motivated by those 14 being values. So just to try to make all this really clear in one crystal clear sentence, we want to become real 3-dimensional people, not inauthentic 1-dimensional performances. So it's a practice of not just showing the select bits that I prefer to be known by whilst hiding away the rest. So you're going to get me at my best and at my worst. But more importantly, I get to acknowledge myself at my best and my worst without distorting the facts. So you get me, but more importantly, I get me. So if we come back to those 3 words that I was talking about earlier on, we've given ourselves the little reminder already to check our perceptions, and that means then that prompts us to check our behaviors, which leads us onto our actions, which is going to be the good results part of that little quote from earlier. And if we've done this correctly, our results should come very, very naturally and without much thought. So a good way to see this in others when they're performing or being genuinely a shining example of what it is to be a human is to think about it in terms of radioactivity. Now, there's a quote in here that I really, really love. So I want to share the full quote with you, and it's on page 113. As ever, I will put it on the screen just to make it all nice and clear. Self-actualizing creativeness is emitted like radioactivity and hits all of life regardless of problems, just as a cheerful person emits cheerfulness without purpose or design or even consciousness. It is emitted like sunshine. It spreads all over the place, It makes some things grow which are growable, and is wasted on rocks and other ungrowable things. So the cheerful person isn't concerned about who he is cheerful towards. It's just an intrinsically motivating state to be in. So he is cheerful because it is subjectively enjoyable and delightful to be cheerful. To use, again, some of Maslow's phrasing, especially with delightful. The instrumental value of cheerfulness is irrelevant. The state of cheerfulness itself is motivation enough to continue being cheerful. And you can swap out cheerful there for words like curiosity or generosity or being charitable or being creative and anything like that. But because they're all motivated by the being values, they're all going to be inherently motivational states to be in. So just to make all this really clear, the creative person doesn't have to try to be creative. He just emits creativity. If anything, trying to stop the creative person from emitting creativity is more difficult. And that's a good sign that you're on the right path to self-actualizing. You can't help but simply be a fuller version of yourself. Capacities clamour to be used and cease their clamour only when they are used sufficiently. That's another Maslow quote to further reinforce a point like this. So we've all got these different capacities, but we all share the common concern or question of whether we actually use them or not. Or, I suppose more accurately, to what extent are we in touch with our capacities, and to what extent are we using them? Now, I've created plenty of lessons already on getting in touch with the inner child or inner children, and parts work, and subpersonality work, and golden shadow work, and pursuing fulfillment over achievement, and the importance of attitude as a value, and plenty of others. So, very much in keeping with the message of this lesson, no single one starts apart from the rest. So, stands apart, from the rest. In terms of my radioactivity, I can't help but be curious and to learn for the sake of learning and to pass on that learning to anyone who is willing to listen. So that's how I can tell if these lessons are going well or not. The metrics like subscribers and likes and whatever else are completely irrelevant. It's much more important for me to be in touch with how I feel about the lessons in the moment of teaching them and how they affect me as a whole person as I then go about my day and my week. And I pay close attention to what motivated me to create a particular lesson or to carry on making them, even if they are a little bit clunky and clumsy at times, just like how I just fell over that sentence there. All of these lessons for me, they're intrinsically valuable rather than instrumentally valuable. They're rewarding to create in themselves, and because they're in good alignment with those being values, they're likely going to resonate with others so that others can benefit from them as well. Maybe that's true for you watching this right now. I have no idea. Let me know if that's the case. But just to bring these three lessons together, I just wanted to show you how I use this type of information in a practical and on an ongoing kind of way as well. So we've got three mini lessons in one there. And to make it all practical, just to keep in mind 1, 2, or 3 of all these things as you go about your week. So first of all, it is to see the whole person and not just the abstracted bits that you prefer or that you hate. And also, while we're there, to check our motivations and to see to what extent you are in line with those 14 being values. And then to also consider this idea of your values and your characteristics in terms of radioactivity. Does being cheerful feel like an effort? And if it does, is this leaning more towards an intrinsic or extrinsic type of motivation? In Maslow's language, is it be motivated or demotivated? But more on that another time. Just swap out the word cheerfulness for whatever applies to you and go from there, and I'll see you in a future lesson. See you then.